Again, this cemetery, as you walk through it, is going to be one historical personage after the other. We're now in the Todd lot. As of course you know, Mary Todd Lincoln was born here in Lexington, and you will see many of the Todd family that is buried here. And the Todds were a very prominent family that came to this area very early on and established themselves as large landowners and of course in civic affairs as well. And so when Mary Todd Lincoln was born, she was born into what would be called the local aristocracy. And sometimes many people thought she married down when she married Abraham Lincoln. And of course, she had her eyes set on him. But here, we're going to have, as you can see, some of the oldest tombstones that were brought from other places and placed here. And of course, the Todd monument here. This even goes back to Levi and John Todd, and of course Robert Todd, Mary Todd Lincoln's father. John Todd was actually killed at the Battle of Blue Licks, and in 1782, in August of 1782, and it was said for many years Mary Todd was terrified of the American Indian because her Uncle John had been killed by them. And so Mrs. Lincoln, Mrs. Todd Lincoln as we'd say, she had her difficulties, as we all know. And unfortunately her son, Robert, put her in the insane asylum for a brief period of time. And she had a very, very, very tragic life. But we have a person here with us today who is very well known to the Lincoln family and to the Todd family. Unfortunately, Mrs. Lincoln wasn't too fond of this gentleman, but he was the early law partner of Abraham Lincoln. And this gentleman knew Lincoln like many other people would not have known him. And we're going to let him talk to you about his reminiscences. And I would like to introduce to you Mr. Billy Herndon.
All I will say about Mary Todd is I never liked her. We never got along very well. She had come up to Springfield to stay with her sister Elizabeth and her husband Ninian Edwards. Now the Edwards were a powerful aristocratic family up in Springfield. And Mary Todd had come from Lexington, Kentucky because she couldn't get along with her stepmother and she was looking for a husband. She was 21, it was time. And there was a ball held in Springfield, and I was there, a number of eligible young bachelors, which was why she was there. I asked her to dance. After a few steps, I sought to compliment her. I said, "Miss Mary, you glide along with the ease of a serpent." She didn't take that as a compliment. And our relationship never got any better. Well, enough about Mary Todd. Abraham Lincoln was my partner and friend for 18 years. They called him a baboon, a murderer, slave lover, and they called him the great emancipator, savior of the Union, a saint, but I called him friend. Now, many a day in the office, he would sprawl out his 6'4" and read out loud from a book or a newspaper. If I was working on a case, I'd plead with him, "Abe, hush up, I got work to do." And he'd say, "Billy, I like to read out loud. That way I catch the idea by two senses. I see and I hear what I'm reading, I remember it better." Sometimes I had to leave the office just to get my work done. Well, after he finished reading, he'd want to tell me a new story or a joke or a riddle, and sometimes it wasn't something you could say in front of ladies. Well, many people thought he was a simple man. Oh, that Mr. Lincoln, he is so plain. Mr. Lincoln is so modest. Mr. Lincoln is so unambitious. Well, such men were dead wrong. And the political life became his life, his haven. And from first to last, his approach to politics was purely practical. Now, he had his goals, his ideals, and they were good and pure, but his methods were purely practical. He was a cunning fox. He was a shrewd manipulator of men. One example, the men he chose for his administration all opposed him. Before they knew it, they were on his side. In the long run, he had his way. Now, you know, he didn't start out an abolitionist, but by the 1850s, he saw that the new Republican Party offered him the chance of becoming president, but that chance would only be given to the man who could win over the abolitionists of the North and the East, men like Horace Greeley, Sumner, Seward, Garrison. These were the men who could put him in the White House. Trouble was, they didn't think he was strong enough in his opposition to slavery. They needed to be convinced. Well, the opportunity came October 1859. He was asked to speak in Buffalo, New York. I remember the day that invitation came. He came stooping through the door, came up to me and said, "Billy, should I go? And if I go, what should I talk on?" I said, "Mr. Lincoln, by all means, go. This is the opportunity you've been waiting for. You talk on politics. That's your best subject. It'll lead you to the White House." Well, the speech was given at the Cooper Union, February 27th, 1860. Horace Greeley said it was the best political speech he'd ever heard. It paved Lincoln's way for his triumphant march through the North. At whistle stops, he'd come out on the rear car and he would say, "I hold this truth to be self-evident, that what is right in Connecticut is right in South Carolina. What is wrong in Connecticut is wrong in South Carolina. I hold human slavery to be wrong in Connecticut, and I hold human slavery to be wrong, eternally wrong, in South Carolina." Well, it was close. He lost the popular vote, but he won the electoral vote. Now, I didn't see the new president-elect much after the election. He was swarmed by office seekers. They rolled in the dust and kissed his feet to win his favor. They asked for a hair from the tail of his old horse. It was a disgusting carnival. The day before he left for Washington, he came by the office and sprawled out on the sofa for the last time. We were mostly silent, and then we talked some. After a while, he got up, picked up some papers and books, and we went downstairs and shook hands, said goodbye. And I watched that tall, gaunt, stooping figure disappear down the street. And I ached with loneliness. The country had a new president, but I had lost my best friend and my partner. Now, he knew his inaugural speech would be read by slave owners and abolitionists alike, and he wanted to get it right. He reached out generous hands to both sides. He urged patience and caution, and he ended with these words: "In your hands, my dissatisfied fellow Americans, not in mine, is the momentous issue of civil war. The government will not assail you. There can be no conflict without yourselves being the aggressors." Well, he moved too slow for me. But he was president, I was not, but he moved too slow. Country was in turmoil, more and more states were seceding, and yet he did nothing. Finally, the rebels forced him to move when they fired on Union troops at Fort Sumter and Charleston Harbor. The war had begun, battle lines were drawn, blood began to be spilled, and yet he hesitated and hesitated and hesitated to do anything about slavery. Horace Greeley said he had no plan or policy. Well, finally, after the war dragged on, he felt the time had come. It was the fullness of the hour to free the slaves. He issued a warning in the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. There was no response. So on January 1st, 1863, the reluctant emancipator freed 4 million people. Freeing the slaves was not the end of his troubles. In 1864, he called up 500,000 men. Thousands of them would not return. The knowledge he was sending them into the jaws of death weighed heavily on Lincoln. At a military hospital in City Point, Major Charles Houghton lay dying. Now, he'd been wounded while serving under General Grant at Fort Haskell. His leg had to be amputated. He was brought to the military hospital to die in peace. There was no hope for him. He lingered in the borderland of life and death. 9 o'clock one morning, the door at the end of the ward opened and the chief surgeon called out, "The President of the United States." And Lincoln walked in, and he stooped at every cot to whisper a word of cheer to the wounded. As he approached Houghton's cot, he said, "Is this the man who saved Fort Haskell?" And he asked for a chair, put down his stovepipe hat on the dusty floor. And he took Houghton's hand in his, and Houghton struggled to open his eyes. And he leaned in and he whispered that he knew of his great deeds. Houghton struggled to speak. And then the president did a strange thing. He asked to see the wound. Now, the nurses and doctors tried to dissuade him, but he was insistent. He said, "I too must bear the horrors of war." And he said, "A wound is a holy thing." And he watched as they unraveled that long, blood-stained bandage. And he saw. And he stood up and he threw out his long arms and said, "Oh, this war, this awful, awful war." Tears coming down his face. He leaned over and the tears dropped on the white sheets, and he took Houghton's head in his hands and kissed him on the forehead just below the damp hairline. And he said, "You must live. You must live." And Houghton managed to drag his hand up to his forehead in a pale salute, and he said, "I intend to, sir." And he did. He lived. Such acts of kindness and compassion I have heard related in dozens of stories through the years. But do not misunderstand me. Lincoln was a tough president. If he had been a man of all heart, this country would have gone to ruin, as it almost did. So he was burdened with a sorry lot of generals. Then he found some generals who could win the war for him. You know the names: Sheridan, Sherman, Grant, who, like me, was a little too fond of whiskey. One day a delegation came to Lincoln. They wanted Grant removed from his post. And they went through a number of reasons why, and finally they settled on the real reason. Said, "Mr. Lincoln, he drinks." Lincoln said, "Well, what does he drink?" Said, "Well, Mr. Lincoln, whiskey, and in unusual quantities." Lincoln said, "Well, Find out what Brandy drinks and send a barrel of it to my other generals. He wins victories. Those people that thought he was leading this country to hell were dead wrong. Oh, as early, before the re-election, there were signs of victory. As early as 1863, he was looking forward to peacetime. A little place called Gettysburg. He was asked to speak, dedication of a national cemetery. His place on the program was an afterthought. The main speaker was Edward Everett, the great orator, whose speech took up 2 sides of a newspaper page. Lincoln's was somewhat shorter, under 300 words. Well, the news got better and better for the North in the winter of '64, the spring of '65. Sherman delivered Savannah to Lincoln as a Christmas gift while Grant battered away at Lee in Virginia, and then in April, Sherman moved his troops up through the Carolinas, and Lee, facing insurmountable odds, surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse. Well, Lincoln had done it. He had kept the Union together. Now, he wanted to see the big prize. He wanted to see the capital of the Confederacy again under federal control. Above all else, he wanted to see Richmond. With his son Tad in hand and an old Negro as a guide, they walked the 1.5 miles through the streets. The freed slaves were wild with joy. They shouted and danced, and they kneeled at his feet. And he said, "No, do not kneel to me. You must kneel to God only. I am but God's instrument. But rest assured, as long as I live, no man shall ever put a shackle on your limbs again." And an old ex-slave tipped his hat to Lincoln, and Lincoln tipped his hat to the old gentleman. Now, when news of Lee's surrender reached Springfield, the town went wild with joy. The fire department led a parade through the town square. They brought out a donkey with a straw dummy on it, and a placard on its back said, "Jeff Davis, last ride." And another placard on the donkey's rear said, "Lee's end." And there were 21 gun salutes, speeches, fireworks, and town went to bed drunk with joy and victory. Over in Washington, bands serenaded the White House with songs like Columbia, the Gem of the Ocean, Star Spangled Banner. And then Lincoln said, "Play Dixie. It's ours again." Well, the war was almost over, but the final act of the bloody drama was yet to be played out. Now, you see, there had been assassination attempts before. Lincoln knew the president's life was always in danger. He just didn't have time to worry about it. His day began early, ended late. After dinner, he would meet with senators, congressmen, generals about affairs of state and of the war. But every once in a while, he'd take a night off, go to a concert or a lecture or the theater. He did not want to go see Our American Cousin that Friday night. He'd seen it before. It wasn't good enough to see again. Unfortunately, he gave in to Mrs. Lincoln's insistence. Well, you know what happened. 5 days earlier, we were wildly celebrating Lee's surrender, and suddenly we were wild with grief. Church bells tolled their sad requiem. Mourning wreaths were placed on every door. No business was conducted. Men gathered round the telegraph, listening for news. And over at Oak Hill Cemetery, the ground was being prepared to receive her son. And violets were bursting through the greening earth. The spring wheat was sprouting. Apple trees blossomed, white and pink, and lilacs garlanded the land for Lincoln's homecoming. It was done. He'd returned to the people from whom he'd sprung, and to whom he knew he must one day return. And in my searches for the true Lincoln, I went by the old Indiana homestead, site of his formative years where his mother and sister lay buried. The cabin where he grew to be a man was gone, but I walked beneath the apple trees he'd helped his father plant half a century before, stood on the ground that he'd plowed and harvested the crops that fed him and his family. I was taken half-mile down the road to his mother's grave. It was unmarked, sunken, overgrown with brush and briar. I hitched my horse to a nearby tree and I knelt down beside that poor neglected grave and I said, "Oh, Nancy Hanks Lincoln, if I could whisper in your ear, your son was president of these United States." Thank you, that's all I have.
Thank you, Mr. Herndon. That was very, very, very well said. One thing I should point out about the Todd family, and of course including the Lincoln family, Mary Todd Lincoln suffered a great deal from derision and actual accusations of being disloyal to the United States because her brother and her half-brothers were all Confederate soldiers. And you can only imagine in that terrible, terrible war when the First Lady of the land's brothers were actually fighting against her husband. Sometimes we forget the human tragedy there and all of that, and Mr. Lincoln actually did have to go and say words to a committee actually saying his wife was loyal. And that is one of the great tragedies that Mrs. Lincoln had to suffer. And of course, that was something that we all understood, especially here in Kentucky.